live.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Ycat'S petition live stream. My name's Eva McGowan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 18 years old. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm the policy director at Ycat.
And hi, I'm Aiden
Hi
Jason.
everyone, welcome to the Ycat'S petition
I'm
live stream. My name's Eva McGowan. I use
Communication
she, her
director
pronouns. I'm 18
at
years old. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio.
Ycat, and and I'm excited for you all to be here. My pronouns are he, him, his. And Grace.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Jensen. I'm 18 years old. I use she, her, hers, and I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and I am the finance director of Ycat.
All right. Okay. All right, so we're just going to start by talking about some of the effects of the climate crisis in the world today. In the past couple decades, California has warmed by 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 3 times the global average. This is just one example within our country, but things like that have been happening across the globe. Wildfire season has increased by 75 days in the past 2 decades, and as droughts worsen, farmers in Wisconsin will be unable to produce significant crops. And due to the big agribusiness and the shutting down of small local farms, they're going to be facing a brunt of it rather than the big corporations.
Yeah, and that's a big thing there too. It's not just farmers in Wisconsin too. This is across the world. This is across the nation. And, it's really hard because the hard part is it's not going to be the big business that's really being hit by this. This is the local farmer. This is these are the people, it's the working class that's going to be hit the most, not the big time corporations. Yeah. And so, we talk about there are heat islands too, in like big cities. We're seeing heat really be concentrated in urban areas. So, it's not just happening in rural counties, and these effects are happening right now. We're seeing hurricanes hit and with extreme effects. We're seeing wildfires rage, as we mentioned before. In Australia, we saw these huge bushfires. So it's clearly a big, big problem right now. And now we just got to address it appropriately. And unlike we have been in the past with, some just subtle actions and focusing on individual actions, which we'll get into later, and how those aren't really how we're going to be solving this crisis. And they're what, the corporations that think, although they are good, I would like to recognize, I'm just saying it's not the end all solution to it by any means. But we'll touch on that later.
Yeah, and like Aiden touched on there, the climate crisis is really affecting frontline and marginalized communities at a significantly higher rate than middle class and white communities. For example, Native American and Indigenous groups protect 80% of the natural resources on this planet that are in conservation, and yet they receive less than 2% of the funding from the federal government that they should. African American and Latinx communities are subject to 40% more particulate waste from automobiles than white Californians. And the trend can be seen across the world. Exposure to bad air pollution is heavily linked with health problems such as heart and lung difficulties, exacerbated asthma, lung cancer, and premature death, which is one of the biggest causes of the health disparities between Black and Latino Americans and white Americans.
Yeah, and it's really important when we talk about the effects of these crises too. We're often seeing this disconnect. It's the communities that are being the hardest, that are usually unable to escape these effects, such as when floods hit, hit, and they usually hit the lower income, marginalized, and those two terms aren't interchangeable, but those communities first, and it's the wealthy and upper class that are able to escape it, to escape these crises and move away. So it's important that we recognize that too.
Oh yeah. So all of these things obviously are how the climate crisis is affecting people, but one of the biggest misunderstandings is what the cause of the climate crisis is. Now, especially with COVID-19 and the pandemic happening, we're seeing people say things like humans are the virus, when this is not the case at all. That's actually like eco-fascist, and it's a whole different worldview that has roots in some very problematic places. But the root of the climate crisis is actually capitalism and the exploitation of workers and land by the owning class and multinational corporations. Identifying capitalism as a root is often written off as like a radical or like extreme idea, when in reality it's like fairly obvious when you do any sort of critical analysis of what caused the crises. Um, Capitalism is also what extorts and marginalizes groups across the world. It is what creates these disparities between Black, Indigenous people of color and white people. It's what causes the immense like pollution in China. Although China is like theoretically a communist country, the capitalist owning class of China has caused a massive pollution that has like degraded their air quality to what it is today.
Awesome. Yeah. And then so moving from that and sort of to our petition, we think a big start of this is sort of getting this bold climate action now. In August, Governor Evers said that he was going to move our state onto 100% renewable energy by 2050, but that just won't cut it at all. We really don't have any more time yet to like fiddle around until 2050, and we're going to need bold action now by 2030, so then we can mitigate these effects. It's a big problem, and like as we talked about those effects before, those 20 years in between 2030 and 2050 make a big difference.
Yeah, according to the last Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we only have until 2030 to cut global emissions to zero or to at least half in order to move into 100% renewable energy following that. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, we've already seen global warming reach 1.1 degree Fahrenheit across the world. So limiting it as much as possible is essential to ensure the survival of our species and the world as we know it right now. So it's really not any sort of game. We do need 100% of emissions cut by 2030. It would also make Wisconsin the first state signing on to cutting emissions by 2030.
Yeah, so if you want to sign that petition, go to Ycat's.us/petition and scroll down and you can sign it there. We're really trying to get a lot of signatures because this is such a big crisis, and we're seeing the effects all over the world right now with these big wildfire seasons hitting and all the effects we talked about before. But now sort of moving on, we'd like to discuss really how climate change relates to COVID-19 and how those two are sort of clumped together, and sort of how how the climate crisis is such an intersectional issue that they're joined together. Yeah, so Aoife, would you like to touch on that quick?
Yeah, so the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic are actually like inextricably linked. Not only because of the roots in wet markets across the world, which global warming makes it easier to spread contagions in them, but in the marginalized communities that are affected most by climate change, they're also affected the most by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the Navajo Nation in Arizona and New Mexico, which makes up almost 2% of the population from each state, they make up 30% of confirmed coronavirus cases in the states, and they have almost no access to healthcare. They have less than 2% of their roads are certified by the National State Road Safety Services, and they're really depending on getting help from the state, but they're not right now because the Navajo Nation is so cut off from the rest of the state of Arizona. So how is climate change amplifying disease? So climate change has led to a rise of Zika, which rose in 2016, but it's starting to spike again, I'm pretty sure. And it shows the needs for programs that are often written off as socialist or communist or just radical leftist ideas in the United States, but that are really necessary now and been shown to be necessary. Things like a federal job guarantee, paid sick leave right now is especially true with our government and statewide unemployment websites and services being shut down due to an overflow of almost 4 million people requesting in the past week. We need to strengthen these institutions. We need a universal healthcare service to ensure that everyone from indigenous people to like the owning class has access to the same level of healthcare.
It looks like you're frozen, Aoife, but yeah, building on that is like really right now, we're really seeing the need for these big social programs for Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee. And these are all things that we're going to need when effects of the climate crisis really pick up even more. We need them right now, and we're going to need them then. Just like the climate crisis, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. They're the frontline workers, and we're going to see the same thing with COVID-19. So it's really important that not just for not just for this crisis, the things that we need to help get people through this crisis is the things that we're going to need to get people through the climate crisis. So it's really important that we pass that legislation now and we get that bold action done. And just start off. Of course, we're going to have to keep building on that, but it's really important that we start fighting for this now, because this is just a hint at what we're going to see with the climate crisis as it intensifies. Yeah. Aoife, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think we touched on that pretty well. Do we want to move into the general discussion?
Yeah, so now we're going to open up to a general discussion that we have. So, and then we'll go around and do intros for all people. We're going to add in. Let's see. Awesome. So to start this off, we are going to be discussing what does climate change and what does climate justice mean and look like to you. But we'll start off with going through some introductions by everybody. So we'll say our name, age, pronouns, and your title if you have one, and location. So I'm Aiden Dreesing, as we talked about before. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm 16 years old. I'm the communications director of Youth Climate Action Team, and I'm from Madison. Sophie, would you like to go?
Yeah, hey, my name's Sophie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, but right now I'm living in Philadelphia. Eleanor, do you want to go?
Yeah, hi, I'm Eleanor. Any pronouns work. I'm from Minnesota, living in Minnesota. And do we say age? I'm 17. Awesome. Tristan?
I'm Tristan. I'm 17, living in Puerto Rico. My pronouns are he, him. Does Grace want to go?
Hi, once again, I'm Grace. I use she, hers. I'm 18 and I'm in Madison and the finance director of Ycat'S. And Lauren, would you like to go?
Sure. My name's Lauren. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm one of the co-city leads for Milwaukee's Youth Climate Action Team. Madeline, have you gone?
No. Gwen in Dalisi Metlen. Galoy Weaving Magi Galoy Yakadi. My name is Madeline. I'm 16 years old. I'm from Appleton, and I am the Appleton City Lead.
Awesome. And so I think that's everybody now. So I guess then we're going to open up discussion to the question, what does climate justice mean? What does it look like to you? Would anybody like to start off by answering that right away?
I can answer. So to me, climate justice is more than passing a Green New Deal or electing someone who just believes in climate change to the presidency. Climate justice is restoring Indigenous lands to their people, ensuring that every child affected by the Flint water crisis has access to universal healthcare system. And climate justice is building ultimately a working class coalition that will be able to dismantle capitalism and bring social and economic justice to everyone.
Awesome. Does anybody have anything to add to that? Or
Yeah, I would just say, like, kind of building on that, climate justice means like being transformative instead of reformative. We need to very much build from the ground up, and the result ecological devastation is the result of all of these injustices, like within like previous social justice movements. It's about LGBTQ plus inequity. It's about Black, Brown, Indigenous communities being exploited. This is a culmination, and it's the result of people, resources, land being exploited under capitalism. And so to combat that, we really need to build on foundations of mutuality, coalition building, and yeah, basically like transforming the way that we've previously gone about doing things in society.
Awesome. Who would like to speak next on sort of what climate justice means to them? Building on to this conversation.
If anyone wants to talk about how they personally fight for climate justice and how they see the fight for climate justice going in the future, that's also like totally welcome in this conversation.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit going off of what you both said, like really like realizing the root of the climate crisis is like capitalism, and we can be doing things like electing officials and like fighting for a Green New Deal, but also just like always having in the back of your mind that like that's really never going to be enough, and we're going to be having to like completely reshape our society and what it looks like. And so we're doing these things as we're going along that process of like harm reduction and like helping people who are being like, affected by the climate crisis right now and like need relief, but also just like always realizing that we're going to need to completely reshape society.
I think it's also really about switching the narrative from what has previously been sort of uplifted in the environmental movement, which has been white, able-bodied voices and stuff like that, and talking about animals and, oh, like the polar bears. So like this is now, like as a disabled person, like we are on the front lines. Like I see like the way it affects us and like stuff like that. Like it's like we are experiencing this now. It's humans who are on the front lines of this. And as much as like we would love to like focus on just the polar bears, like lives are in danger right now, and that's what makes this a crisis.
Would anyone else like to speak on what climate justice means to them?
Yeah, so I think the thing about like she was just saying like it disproportionately affects marginalized communities, and a lot of the reason that is because like the climate crisis didn't just happen. It happened because of the systems that are in place. It happened because of colonialism, and it happened because of capitalism. And those systems were built off of the oppression of others. And as time went on, that oppression didn't go away. It just changed in the way that it affected different communities. So because of that, the climate crisis happened, and because of that, it's affecting marginalized people more and more. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we aren't even acknowledging the root of the problem. And if we don't know why it happened, then how are we expected to fix it?
Awesome. And we like to sort of like build on that, really getting into sort of like how capitalism is the root and how these systems are so fundamentally set up to, extend the effects of the climate crisis and, how it created it. Anybody like to build on that?
So yeah, capitalism is ultimately like the root of the climate crisis, and it's what's brought us to this point as far as like seeing the exploitation and like unfettered, unregulated businesses such as Amazon forcing employees to work through a global pandemic, putting them on the front lines of a crisis without providing them any hazard pay. Many people don't really see the connections between like the exploitation of labor and the climate crisis. They're so deeply entwined because like these communities that are being forced to work at the crisis, being forced to work through the pandemic, are the same communities whose labor is being exploited to like fund these like planes flying across the world, these 2-day shipping, things that are entirely unsustainable and unable to be kept up with without causing like immeasurable damage to our planet. And we live under a system right now that is entrenched with the colonial exploitation of the global South, which has directly led to the destructive resource consumption of the elites, especially in the Western nations. But if anyone wants to speak on like what motivated them to get involved with the climate justice movement or anything like that, would be great.
Do you mind if I speak a little bit more on capitalism? Yeah, so basically the way that capitalism works is it relies on the labor of others, and it relies on there always being like a lower class that works for profit. And there's two ways that you can drive up profits. You can either pay your workers less, or you can cut costs of production. And a lot of the ways that people cut the costs of production is by not caring about environmental regulations or workers' rights or anything like that. So that's like, it's an inherently bad system because it's unsustainable. It relies on growth for the sake of growth, and there's no end to it. But the resources on Earth, although it's vast, they're finite. So it can't just, it isn't endless. There's no way that business can keep growing and growing and growing and it not have any effect on the environment.
Yeah, building off of that, we've actually seen this happening right here in the United States. Our president actually suspended most EPA regulations on businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic in an attempt to like save growth and support the economy, when in reality, environmental destruction ultimately will lead to a collapse of the capitalist system.
And I'd also like to say, I think Madeline touched on this a bit, but like a huge motivator is to create things for not for consumption, but to sell in a way. And so we are producing cheap things that will break quickly so that people buy more, and this creates waste and emits these pollutants and stuff like that, and it causes such an issue.
Yeah, creating artificial prices and like artificial scarcity is something that we're seeing a lot right now. Farmers being forced to throw away their crops, not even farmers, but like farming corporations that own hundreds of thousands of acres in places like Texas and the Midwest are dumping potatoes, dumping milk when marginalized communities need those right now to survive. So that's just one example of like environmental racism and like food deserts and things like that.
Yeah, and this strays away a little well, not really. So really, when I talk about like climate justice too, I find it important that we really like talk about the systems of it, because, you know, like growing up, and I'm sure this happened with most people around the world right now, you're being told that the solution of the climate crisis is really like, you know, by going vegan, you know, picking up trash, and, you know, using metal straws. And now those are all like very important things, right? But if they're not going to solve the climate crisis. When we have a system set up so fundamentally, so fundamentally broken system set up that is the cause of this crisis, we really need to be attacking that. So and the corporations want us to think about, you know, doing these individual actions because it places the blame on the individual rather than the corporations and the creators of this crisis. And in addition to that, you know, it's important to talk about how things like veganism aren't accessible to all communities, because Aoife just talked about how, you know, there are food deserts. And, you know, when you're in a food desert, which is, you know, when you don't have access, I think the definition is when you live a mile away from a supermarket without access to get there to like a car or a vehicle of some sort. So, you know, when communities live in food deserts, which are predominantly, you know, marginalized communities, they don't have access to get necessarily healthy or vegan foods all the time. And so when you're pushing veganism as the solution to the climate crisis, you're, you know, sort of playing into what the corporations want us to think about individual actions, and also, you know, making people like feel bad for not necessarily being able to complete that action. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to be saying that those actions aren't doing anything. I'm just saying that they're not the root of the crisis. You know, we got to be solving the crisis by attacking the systems that created it.
And also a lot of those those things about individual action really play into eco-fascism and really shaming people for not being able to do them and just contributing to other things like we said, like food deserts. Those are predominantly in non-white and working class communities, as well as like being with many disabilities and stuff. It is close to impossible to be vegan because your health is already such an issue and different things like that. And then when you're shamed for those, it's like contributing to the systems that are part of eco-fascism and also really contributing to the mindset that, oh, the people who can't be doing these things are the cause of the crisis, when it's actually corporations and capitalism, colonialism, all those systems.
Yeah, we actually see this really like exemplified, over the past couple of days with like the Future Coalition like a global like Earth Day live stream and the media focus on people like Greta Thunberg, who I have nothing against, but these people promote the ideas of like digital striking and like weekly school strikes, and while those can be effective, they don't actively combat or draw attention to the systems that have created the crisis. And by highlighting people doing vegan food recipes and things like that, the media is pushing the narrative of individual action over systemic change, which hurts the movement in an attempt for them to protect their own wealth.
Would anybody like to build on anything that was just said? Or anything just in general? Otherwise, we'll move to our next question.
I was just going to add something kind of like surrounding the idea of electoralism. I think Sophie mentioned this earlier, like we can fight for a Green New Deal and like take those little wins. But in reality, with our system of electoralism, we kind of have to like demolish it. And there's kind of like this idea around the presidential election that we should settle for the lesser of two evils, especially with like climate plans. But in reality, if we want to solve the climate crisis and systematically change our system, we have to have like a political revolution and kind of like transform all our systems and, you know, demolish capitalism and flow into these better systems that don't exploit people.
I totally agree with Grace. We need to build a working class movement of people who are willing to reclaim the value of their labor and reject the idea of electoralism, because it restricts our political actions to like being within elections and every 4 years, like this presidential cycle that we're always sucked into. And we really don't need to settle for a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump. We need to reject the idea that these people are like legitimate leaders and then our elections are like a legitimate process for like representing the voice of the American people, and build movements outside of that to advocate for the change that is necessary. All right, unless anyone wants to talk, we'll move into our section on intersectionality.
Okay, yeah. So I guess, you know, that sort of question that we're asking then is, what does it mean to build an intersectional movement? What is building an intersectional movement, and like, what does it mean? So would anybody like to start off with that discussion, sort of talking about that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. Like, so with like intersectionality, it's like the idea that all these different like systems and like oppressive systems, like the patriarchy and like with like sexism and like racism and classism and stuff, they're all like intertwined, and like you can't experience one without experiencing the other, and like they're all rooted in the same issue. And so like that idea just like really goes into the climate crisis a lot, because of when you boil it all down, it all comes back down to like capitalism. And so like with what Grace was talking about, like with electoralism, with like the idea that like you can elect people and they'll end up helping you, it's like the political system was still built on like this idea of capitalism, and like the way that people like corporations can really like fund elections and like make sure that someone wins. And with like Joe Biden, like he's funded by all these people that are making sure that he's having all these ads, and like, yeah. And so basically with the intersectionality is like, you can't just focus on the earth and the environment and like the water systems, because then you have to figure out like, why are the water systems getting polluted? Why are like all these emissions going into the air? Like, it's not just because people aren't recycling, and it's not because people aren't eating locally sourced food. It's because people are making sure that we don't have access to these things, and making sure that it's hard for people to like live a sustainable life, and making sure that they can make a profit any way possible.
Yeah, so that's all really important, and I totally agree that like the way that we are framed and taught to think about the climate movement is to like reject intersectionality and focus it as on like a single issue, like activism or single issue organizing, which really does not exist. There's no such thing as like single issue organizing or single issue voters. We're all influenced by all these different like injustices and how they affect us. So one topic we'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on is how can the climate justice movement best address environmental racism and the inequitable impacts on BIPOC and other frontline communities? And how can we balance pressuring government institutions to take action now to address these issues with radical revolutionary actions that reject electoralism?
Do you want to give a little summary of that question right there? That was sort of a long one for us.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So if anyone wants to talk about like how we think that we should best address like environmental racism and like how Black and Indigenous people of color in their communities have like 40% more exposure to like air pollution particles in parts of California, they're more likely to be essential workers, things like that, and how you think we should balance like advocating for like the government to change things so that people have access to clean water rather than lead water, with like focusing on radical and revolutionary action. So like, how do you see the climate justice movement like balancing those two initiatives?
I can speak on this because I think it also has to do a lot with our electoralism question. Here in Milwaukee, like the only reason why we have the lead exposure, lead contaminant issue is because years ago, the mayor, who was also like a profiteer, a capitalist, one who took capital, brought in people who were enslaved, made them mine lead in Wisconsin, and then used that lead to make up the infrastructure for the entirety of the city, like by force. And that points to some inherent flaws in, there's nothing wrong with the idea of electoralism. Let me just start with that. It's the problem is that we have capitalist institutions based in white supremacy and colonialism and those other ideologies. That's what makes it a problem, and it makes it faulty. So that's how we get those issues. We need to acknowledge that the systems that we have in place, sorry, my dog is whining in the background. The systems we have in place are inherently undemocratic, or don't allow the voices of marginalized communities, and that creates issues like environmental racism and environmental injustice. So balancing that would mean that we need to considerably look at making sure that we are instituting like collective care within our own communities that isn't based in like the harmful practices of the institutions that we have now. So a radical approach to that would be like creating our own systems of support. We're seeing that a lot here in Milwaukee with the mutual aid efforts. And I think that's very wonderful because like we're practicing there like harm reduction. And that's something that we can use in the climate crisis. And that's something that we can use like when we get to that breaking point, because obviously this fight against capitalism and people who are in power, the ruling class, like this is going to take a long time, and we may harm people along the way. So that's how we balance pressure, is by building support in our own communities and like building our own institutions, I guess.
Yeah, I think one particularly vivid like reminder of how inherently undemocratic and inherently racist our current electoral system is was the Wisconsin primary, where there were only 3 polling locations open in Milwaukee and 150 open in Madison, which like points to the great inequities through electoralism. But if anyone else wants to talk on environmental racism or anything along that line, feel free.
Yeah, I think that like the first thing that we have to do is advocate for it, especially if you're talking to someone who is like white or they're upper class or able-bodied, or well, I guess white when we're talking specifically about environmental racism, because a lot of people don't actually know how bad it is for people of color in this country. They just aren't aware because we live in such a separated country. So you need to advocate for that. And the other thing is, with electoralism being the way it is and how hard it is to work within the system because you have all this money and all these people up against you, it's important to take direct action. And you see this a lot in anti-pipeline action and stuff like that, because right now through northern Wisconsin, we have pipeline line 3 and line 5, both by Enbridge. And then we have a tar sands pipeline that goes through the middle of Wisconsin. And the thing is that, like, even though there are 12 tribes in Wisconsin, 11 of them are federally recognized, one of them is not. They don't have that much land in Wisconsin, and yet Line 3 went through the Bad River Reserve. So, like, even though it's so little land, those are the ones that are hit the hardest. And that's not a thing you can solve with electoralism. You saw that when the felony pipeline protest bill got passed in Wisconsin, which makes it a felony to protest against pipelines or to trespass near that pipeline, even if it's on your own land. So the thing is that, like, you can't vote against that because it was passed in the state legislature. And there are my dogs. But you need to take direct action against it because that's the only thing you can do. And I mean, you need to advocate for these communities, but you also need to listen to them, because the thing with indigenous knowledge and land is, like, these people have lived on this continent for tens of thousands of years, and they've managed to do that without messing up the environment, and they've managed to do that. And, like, we have a lot to learn, and we need to, like, advocate, listen, and take direct action, because electoralism is good, but it's so flawed in the way it's conducted that there's kind of a limit to, like, how much we can do with that.
I entirely agree. Trying to work and make reform within a like imperialist colonial system is inherently flawed, and you're limited by that like very thing. People are passing laws that prevent you from protesting. They limit our ability to free speech and to things, which is why we need like revolutionary and radical politics to reject these systems. But if anyone else wants to speak, the floor is open.
I guess I kind of might jump in here because I'm really trying to push that the narrative of disabled voices within the climate movement, because so often we are erased. And similar to BIPOC folks, like, we are on the front line of this. Like, I feel like right now, especially, our issues are maybe getting a little more light, hopefully not really much, but just because of coronavirus, immunocompromised people are really kind of are even more at risk. And I just feel like right now, we're almost seeing what it will be like when the climate crisis reaches the point at which Corona has, and who will be left behind and who is already being left behind are the communities most impacted by Corona as well. And also really just talking about like how there are I really want to emphasize the point that not only are disabled people one of the most affected groups by the climate crisis, because we can't evacuate in disasters. We rely on life-saving medications that without access to it can be extremely we cannot survive, and just many factors, as well as existing health issues just being made worse by the air pollution, by extreme heat and extreme cold and stuff like that. That is all something we are struggling with, and definitely the symptoms of like that are like worsening our health issues, as well as making it much more difficult for us to exist in society. But capitalism is inherently ableist in its the mindset, because capitalism, in order to have money, and therefore, and in a system at which your basic human rights are determined by how much money you have, you need to be producing valuable labor and like what's productive and stuff. And anything that judges you based on your ability is inherently ableist, because obviously disabled people don't have the same abilities as able-bodied people, and are worth being based on that is ableist. And really just showing how we need to deconstruct all these systems, or else like we're gonna face other crises. If not, and we can't solve the climate crisis with this, it'll just get within capitalism, it'll just get worse. And yeah.
Yeah, and just for any viewers who are maybe a little confused by what we mean when we're talking about electoralism, that's the idea that politics can only be conducted through elections like the presidential election, senatorial, congressional, anything like that. So we are really trying to like reject that idea and push the idea that revolutionary medical politics exist outside of those spaces. But if anyone wants to talk who hasn't maybe spoken yet about what climate justice means to them, or like building an intersectional movement, the floor is open. We'd love to hear from you.
I can speak about what climate justice means to me. So, being from Puerto Rico, I've lived through plenty of storms and hurricanes, particularly Hurricane Maria in 2017, which led to the death of thousands of Puerto Ricans. I was able to witness how the federal government and the presidential administration and federal recovery agencies like FEMA neglected the island and neglected delivering aid after the hurricane. That allowed me to be witness to what imperialist entities like the US really think of their colonial subjects. And that really, it didn't open my eyes, because I was already conscious of what it meant to, I guess in a way I was already conscious since I was born of what it meant to be a colonial subject, but it just further solidified the fact that climate justice, that for us to survive for future hurricanes that will be exacerbated by climate change and further meteorological events and events like droughts, which we suffer through a lot, the only way for us to be able to survive them and for thousands of people to not die again like they did after Hurricane Maria is for decolonization and, in my opinion, complete independence from the US. And that doesn't just apply to Puerto Rico, it applies to Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, the Virgin Islands. It applies to colonies held by imperial powers all over the world. That's my take on climate justice.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Does anybody else have like anything they would like to add on to any of those points? Or just anything else that they would like to say? And then other than that, if not, we might move on to our next point then, past the discussion. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all for sort of talking with us about these very important subjects, and relating this sort of back to our petition that we talked about earlier. Everything that was talked about today, for example, is why we need to take this bold action that we're demanding from Governor Evers, because, you know, we've talked about the effects in Wisconsin and the effects across the world even, that the climate crisis is causing. And we really need bold action now to properly address this. And, you know, it starts, some of our work will start with getting Governor Evers to get Wisconsin onto 100% renewable energy by 2030. And, you know, then from there, as the first state to be able to do that, if he does make that executive order, you know, will be a true leader, and hopefully more states will follow. But that is not where our work ends, and we really want to emphasize that. So Aoife, would you like to sort of detail what Ycat will be doing moving forward and what that really means for us about a general strike and pushing for that?
Yeah, so moving forward, Ycat is calling for a general strike in 2030. And I'm just going to start by kind of going through what a strike is and what a general strike is and like the goals of what those are. So a strike is a work stoppage caused by the mass refusal of employees to work, and they usually take place in response to employee grievances or governmental grievances. So labor strikes in particular, they take place pretty often, and they're very effective in making radical change and forcing working conditions to be improved. Some examples are the 20th century labor movement in the United States, with in response to the shirt tail triangle factory fires, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and the meatpacking industry. Mass refusal to work can cause like things like the FDA to be founded, like strict labor laws, child labor laws, things like that. And the 2018 to 2019 US teachers strike across the country, I'm sure plenty of us were either affected by it or knew someone who was affected by it, in places like Chicago, Oklahoma, California, where teachers went on strike for not only improving their own wages, but improving their students' access to equitable education materials and textbooks. But we've noticed that the climate movement has kind of appropriated this word strike and used the example of like school strikes as like refusing to go to school on Fridays or on March 15th and September 20th in particular as like the big school strike days. These aren't labor strikes, and they had no like mandated goals to achieve, so they weren't really doing the purpose of strikes other than like using it as a fun little tagline. So they're a really good way of like gaining attention and garnering media coverage, but they don't create general change because they don't have specific goals in mind, and they aren't large enough and on a wide enough scale to bring an end to business as usual. So as we discussed earlier in the live stream, capitalism is the root of the climate crisis, and capitalism only functions by exploiting resources and workers. So if workers and students are able to effectively reject the owning class and stop and reclaim the value of their labor, we'll be able to have a mass general strike. So what a general strike is a strike action in which a substantial portion of the total labor force in a city, region, or country, hopefully the world in this case, are able to stop work and demand specific changes in the system. So in this case, we would need a general strike to instill the changes that we want, which include a rejection of capitalism and a move towards a communist and socialist society that allows people to have resources distributed to them to their need, and their contribution to no longer be the defining factor in their value to society.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry. Yeah, so like moving forward, that's really what we're hoping for. We want to build a wide coalition and a big movement pushing for this general strike so we can achieve our goals. Because, you know, we talked about how this crisis and pretty much and how the climate crisis is an intersectional movement, and it comes from such a fundamentally flawed system that we're really hoping that by building a movement to push for this general strike moving forward, it's going to take a lot, but hopefully by the time we have this movement built, we will be able to have fundamentally change our nation for the better and the world for the better, because, you know, it's really capitalism is at the root of so many problems. And so when we push for this fundamental change, we're going to make a big difference by this. So do you have anything else to add on to that, Aoife? Other than that, that's...
No, I think that's pretty great. Yeah, if you want to join Ycat and learn more about why we're calling for a general strike or how capitalism is the root of the climate crisis and most other social and economic inequities, you can go to ycat.us/join, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah, so awesome. And once again, please sign our petition demanding that Governor Evers moves to 100% renewable energy by 2030. You can find that at ycat.us/petition. Yeah, I really hope everybody who watched this was able to take something away from this. And yeah, I'd like to thank all the panelists for being on. But yeah, thank you guys.